Lesson 2, I'm going to go over variables and what you can store in them and what you can do with Python, some of the variable types that you can use with Python. It might be a longer video, and I'm hoping it doesn't last too long, but I just want to go over a bunch of little things, okay? So what is a variable? A variable is something in Python that allows you to basically act as a container for some sort of information, just like how you would use it in math or some other things, right? These containers can hold a wide variety of things, and Python doesn't actually care what you hold in a container or not. It will make the container accommodate the item that's within it, if that makes sense. So there are a few rules. Your container has to start with a character. So by a character, I mean a character of the alphabet. It can be uppercase or lowercase. And typically we have naming conventions that make them easier to read, right? So I don't want to not know what you're making when you use a variable. Well, that's kind of like theory. Let's kind of put it into practice. Let's say I want to make a number, right? Let's say my number, right? And so I have it very readable. See that it starts with letters of the alphabet, and I can put this little hyphen in here. I could put something like a dot, but the dot is a reserved thing, so it's gonna break what it is. So certain characters and certain keywords are reserved. Like I can name it my number. I can name it a lot of different things, right? I can't start with a number. That will make it yell at me. I can't use any of the keywords, right? So if I try to use type as a variable name, it will not let me, or really doesn't want to let me. And I don't think you should if you can. So let's say it equals 5, right? I don't think you should do this. I think it looks bad. I think you should let the keywords be keywords, right? And so what we're going to do is, let's say my number, and I like something called snake case, which you basically put a underscore between words. Now, that's a very long name. Normally, you would try to make your variables short, succinct, and tell you what it is. This is just a good example of snake case. There's also something called camel case, which is your first word is lowercase, and every word after that, the first letter of the word is capitalized, right? Which makes it easier to read. So now we know how to make a variable container, right? So let's say my number, and then variables get made when you declare them with some kind of thing inside of it. So you need equals, which essentially says this is going to be a container that contains, or I'm going to assign into it something. And the something we can basically define. So if I want to define a number in Python, I can just use a number. And so I put 5. I could also do things like 5.5, right? But if I do 0.3, it yells at me because that's not a valid number. Now, numbers in Python, there's a few different kinds of numbers, right? So there are integers, things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These things are called ints, right? And there's other types of numbers, like 5.5 we have here, or like things like 0.001, and those things are called floats. There's also another type of number called complex, which represent things like I can't write right now, but a complex is like when you do certain math, there is things like complex numbers, which can be a combination of floats or ints and a complex number to describe how certain things work, right? Now, these numbers can be worked with by many different things. So like if I said 5 plus 5, right, I could assign that into a number. So new number is 5 plus 5, which you would expect it to be 10. So what's happening is this side gets evaluated and it gets assigned into the new number variable, right? You don't necessarily need to now hard code your numbers. You can now do something like my number plus the 5 is going to be assigned to the new number. And this gives us dynamicness with our code, because now we can take things and do operations with things with like more abstract ideas. So what I could do is I can now change what my number is. Like, let's say I took user input here, right? And then now I can add it to a 5. It doesn't matter what the user input was, as long as it was a number, right? So that kind of works there. So what are all these operators, right? So there's a bunch of different operators available in Python. And so for doing things with numbers, you have obviously the normal multiplication, we have division, we have addition and subtraction. We can also use parentheses for things such as PEMDAS, as well as we can do a double star for raising something to a power. And we can also do something called a modulo, which gives us the remainder of a division. And we can use 2 divising things to get the integer division of 2 things, right? So let's kind of go through what all of these mean. So this is just standard multiplication. So you'd write something like my number times 7, or you could do another variable and it would multiply those 2 numbers together. Divide is essentially the same thing. Addition is the same thing but with addition. Subtraction is the same thing but with subtraction. This just tells us precedence. So let's say you need to subtract something before you divide by something. If you made something like this, and these were all, like, let's just say these were variables instead of hard-coded numbers, it would evaluate this first before doing that, and that's just because that's the orders of operations with numbers, right? If I wanted to do this first, I could put parentheses around these, and it would know to do this first before multiplying it by the 6. The double multiplication just means it raises it to a power. So if I do something like 2 like that, that just means 2 to the second power. So it's going to give me 4. This modulo is what we call it. If I do something like 3 and I go modulo 2, we're going to get the remainder of when you divide 3 by 2. So when you learned how to divide in elementary school, you actually learned integer division, right? So if we divide this, 2 goes into it once, and then how much is left over? There's 1. So you're going to get 1 in return. You get the same result if you used a 5, right? Because 2 goes into 5 twice, and then you would have 1 in return. And then we have integer division, which basically does, if you're doing division, it drops off any of the fractional parts of the division. So this can only go into 5 twice, right? And so the remainder, right, gets dropped off. So it just will return a 2, right? And that's something we can do with numbers. Now, there's other things we can do with numbers, right? We can cast them back and forth between things. But let's wait to do that until we have more types of information, right? So something else we have access to is something called a Boolean, or we call it bool in Python for short. So I could say my bool, and that's normally either equal to true or it can be equal to false. And these things are often used more for as flags, such as like, did I see the smallest number? And it would say yes or no, or true or false, right? There are other uses for them, but they're mostly used for program control. So set the flow of the program where you want to go with your code, as well as things such as flags in your program. You can use them like this if you want to, but oftentimes we're not going to set them directly like this. We're going to set them by some kind of other function that will do a bunch of other checks for us. So we don't need to necessarily worry about this too much. You just need to know it exists and it can be used. The last type of information that is very common, right, is a string. A string is just text information. And there's many different ways to declare text information in Python. There's many different ways to load text information in Python as well. But if you're declaring it manually, like in your program like this, you can use double quotes. You can use single quotes, or you can use triple quotes. And each of these things come with pros and cons, and I might go into that in the future. But essentially, a string is anything declared with double quotes, single quotes, or triple quotes, and the content inside the string is what the string itself is. So if I write, hello, this string variable is now holding the word hello, right? And so I can print my string, and I can essentially get, let me run this real quick. Oh, I printed my number. That's awkward. String, there we go. One more time. You'll see that it prints out hello, because that is what's being held in my string. Now my string can do a bunch of different things, right? You can even do it here if you really wanted to. So let's do it like this. My string, actually a better way to explain it is like this. Strings have a bunch of different functionalities in them. And so let's say I want to find the O, or the index of the O in the string. I could do something like this. It's going to tell me what the index of the O is. So if I run this, it's going to tell me in the 4th position is no. And you might look at that and like, that's the 5th character though. Well, strings are things that are iterable, and they're stored in like an array-like structure. And so and arrays always start at 0 in Python. So this is actually the 0th character. This is the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and this is the 4th, which is why it told us that, right? Granted, I just dragged this all the way across. I'm not trying to drag it all the way across. It's the 1st, 2nd, 0, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, right? So we can get an index of a specific number, or a specific, you can even use like other strings to get the index. So if I run this, it will give us 3, because that's where the start of this one is. And we could find the length of this to, capture that if we want to replace it or do something with it. So other things that we can do with strings, we also can capitalize things. So let's say I want to upper it. I can get the upper version of the string. And if I run this now, you'll see that it'll print out the uppercase version of the string, right? There is another one called lower. And if I run this one, you'll notice that it lowercases the h. In the original string, the h is capitalized. It lowercases that, right? There's also a bunch of like random things that can check things for your string. So you can say dot, and I'm gonna go rapid fire over here. So let's say is alpha numeric, right? What this means is, does it contain alphabet and only alphabet and numeric characters, right? So spaces don't count. So if this string had a space, it would automatically fail, right? We also have something called format, which I will teach you how to use later on. Find is similar to index, right? But you can do things such as, if you scroll through here, it tells you kind of things that you can do, but essentially just gives you a index of things, right? You can keep going. Count gives you kind of a count of certain things in the string. So if I did count, then I wrote L, then I ran this, it would tell me there's two L's in hello, and we already know that, but it might be useful in case you have certain situations, right? There are things such as capitalize, which capitalize the first letter. There's all these other checks. It checks if it's just made of alphabets, or if it's made of only ASCII characters, if it's a decimal number, so things like 5.5 and things of that nature. Is it digit? Is it all lowercase? Is it numeric? We can do all these things. Now, all these things have time and space, time and place, but I also think the most common things used are probably the upper lowercase as well as the strip and split, just because those kind of standardize what you're working with. Split will take the string and split it on specific things and make it into a collection of smaller strings, and strip just takes white space off the edges, right? You can also specify it to strip other things off the edge, but normally you use it to strip off white space. So like, let's say that for some reason you read this in from a file and it was something like this. We can get rid of all this white space by calling strip, right? And if I run this, you'll see it will still print hello, but it no longer has all the spaces on the side. Because if it had the spaces on the side, let me delete this real quick. It printed like a little bit out from the edge. See, it's out from the edge. That's a good place to stop for today. We're gonna go over other things later on, but this is a good place to stop. I think you want to digest this, and we're gonna eventually take this and we're going to go into things like program control.